The presentation you are about to hear is taken from a lecture delivered by Mr. John F. McManus early in 1971. The first half of this program is an analysis of political and economic systems containing basic truths which will never be out of date. The second half discusses the conspiratorial forces at work in our world. We ask you to remember that many of the examples and illustrations were current at the time this lecture was recorded, although subsequent events may make some of them seem dated. In time, of course, this same information will serve as important history rather than a discussion of current events. Mr. McManus, who will present an overview of our world, is a graduate of Holy Cross College and a former Marine Corps officer. He was employed as an electronics engineer in New England for several years prior to joining the staff of the John Birch Society in 1966. He has served in numerous positions and currently holds an executive position at the headquarters of the John Birch Society in Belmont, Massachusetts.
As we start this program this evening, I'd like to begin by thanking you all for giving your time and attention to what we have to say. I'm aware of the fact that there are very few Americans who aren't very busy today, and so your willingness to devote some of your time to listen to what I have to say is very appreciated. This entire presentation carries a title, An Overview of Our World. What we propose to do is to supply you with a fundamental premise which we think will help you to understand many of the confusing events of the day. We've all heard the expression about the fellow who couldn't see the forest for the trees. He focused his attention so much on one or two of the trees that he couldn't appreciate the fact that he was in a beautiful forest. And we have countless thousands of Americans today who find themselves focusing all their attention on one significant problem. And there are certainly many problems. And much the same as the individual who couldn't see the forest for the trees, we have a number of people across our nation and around the world today who can't appreciate the fact that the problems that they see are really part of a much bigger problem. What we propose to do this evening, then, is to give you the context in which these problems lie. And we call it an overview. It's our belief that the overview will help you to understand much, if not all, of what is happening in our country. One very important thing to do in an analysis such as this is to give some definitions right at the beginning. We start off with a definition of what we are for, which is simply Americanism. In order to determine what Americanism means, we go right back to the foundation of this nation, to the Declaration of Independence. When our founding fathers decided they'd had enough of British oppression, they wrote the Declaration and set us apart as a new nation. In the Declaration, a small part of it says, we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Right here is the core of Americanism. This small sentence says two very important things. First of all, it says that there is a God, and secondly, that the rights of personal freedoms and private property and freedom of movement, these rights come from no place else but from God, and consequently, no government can take them away. Stop for a minute and reflect on this. Freedoms come from God, not government. You know, a recognition like this at the start of a nation never happened before. No nation ever began with the beginning that we have, and it's because of the truths expressed so well in the Declaration of Independence that our founding fathers went on to build a system of limited government, recognizing that individuals are more important and that the government is the servant, not the master. If we look back over history, we'll see that freedom is an uncommon commodity. In fact, most of the people who have walked the earth have lived a life amounting to slavery. In those isolated instances where freedom did exist, and no one has ever been as free as a citizen in this country, those freedoms were granted by a king, by a ruler, or some governing body, such as the Roman Senate. In every case, these people who did enjoy some amount of freedom found out, history is very clear on this, that if a government can give you freedom, that government can take it away, and it will. This can't happen in our country if we understand and preserve the wisdom expounded by our own founding fathers. They said that rights come from God, and that governments are formed primarily to protect those rights. But how few Americans know their own heritage. I've spoken in schools quite frequently, in high schools and in junior high schools, in colleges and even junior colleges. When I do, I usually begin by asking the students a simple question. My question is, where do you get your right to own property? And so a hand will shoot up over here and a young fellow will jump up and he'll say, government. Well, I wince a little bit inside and say, no, that's not correct. Somebody else try? And another hand will go up, and the second student will get up, and he'll say, the Constitution? And I have to say, no, the Constitution guarantees your right. Where do you get it? Do you know I went through 2,000 students before I finally found a young ninth grader who jumped right up and said, God? Finally, I found someone who understood his own heritage. Well, wherever I've been, I've had to remind students and teachers and anyone who'll listen that if you believe a government gave you your rights, then you'll not complain too long or too loud should a government take them away. You are, in fact, being set up for a dictator. Ask yourself now, what might your own answer have been to the question, where do you get your right to own property? If your answer is anything other than God, you should then ask yourself, how come this very fundamental concept is not right at your fingertips? And so Americanism does have a definition. It starts off with belief in God, who is the source of unalienable rights. It proceeds to limitation of government as the essence of freedom, and to freely accepted moral restraints as the guide for individuals. An important point to consider today is this. Can this appreciation of Americanism be taught in public school? And I'm afraid the answer is no. Because of decisions of the Supreme Court, the teaching of God's existence is no longer possible. Any teacher who positively affirms God's existence can be reprimanded, disciplined, or not invited back. A teacher may present the concept of God as a possibility, but he must also present the other side. How can you teach Americanism without teaching about God? The simple answer is that you can't. Perhaps the real significance of the Supreme Court's decisions is now obvious. The American people have forgotten their own heritage, and if we allow the principles of our nation to fade out of existence, they may never return again. It took close to 6,000 years of recorded history for the truths embodied in the Declaration of Independence to be incorporated as the foundation of a nation. We who have enjoyed more freedom than any man who has ever walked this earth owe it to ourselves to preserve, to protect, and to strengthen Americanism. We also owe it to our children and to generations yet unborn. This then is Americanism, what we are for. We're going now to examine some political systems and give some more definitions. Let's make another important point, however, right at the beginning. We're about to dwell on the different forms of government, and this is certainly important. But when discussing individual freedom, the most important feature of government is not the form, but the amount. We all know what totalitarianism means. It means total government power and slavery for individuals. The feature of totalitarianism that makes it deadly is that the government has total power and the individual has none. No matter what form it may take, total government is destructive of freedom. What this really boils down to is that there's only so much freedom or power available. If the government has all of it, the people have none and are slaves. If the government is limited and has little power, then freedom resides with the individuals. And so, as important as the form of government can be, the most important feature of government vis-a-vis individual freedom is the amount. Now let's proceed to analyze the forms of government. I have 5 listed here, and I think all possible systems are represented. And these are monarchy or dictatorship, ruled by one; oligarchy, ruled by a few, an elite; democracy, ruled by majority; republic, ruled by law; and anarchy, ruled by no one. Let's proceed now to discuss the different forms of government to see if we can't narrow it down to fewer than the 5. We start off by crossing out monarchy, dictatorship, simple rule by one, because it rarely, if ever, exists. Every king has his council of nobles or his earls. Every dictator has the heads of his bureaus. And what these governments always result in is not rule by one, but rule by a few. And quite frequently they select one of their number and they put him up front and they ask him to be the public relations man. And so simple rule by one doesn't really exist. We know that this is true because in 1964 we woke up one day and found out that Khrushchev had been fired. Somebody fired him. They put Kosygin and Brezhnev in charge, and they'll rule until that group someday decides to have someone else. And so we cross off monarchy, dictatorship, and we move on to oligarchy, ruled by a few, an elite. And we state very clearly that this is a very common form of government. It's not only the most common form of government today, but it's the most common form of government in all history. What it means is rule by man, where man has seized control and rules with unlimited power. Let's shift now down to the other side here, and we'll talk about anarchy for a few minutes. The prefix A, or ANA, means without. Anarchy, therefore, means without government. You know, there are some people who really believe that no government is a good idea. These are what we'd call philosophical anarchists, I guess. I think they're foolish, even though we certainly do agree that government sometimes can be very, very evil. Philosophical anarchists overlook a very important feature of human nature, and that is that there are such things as robbers and killers and plunderers. It's precisely because there are criminals that we have chosen to hire a police force to protect ourselves. We could either do it ourselves, or we can pool our resources and ask somebody to do it for us. This is what we have done, and this is government. In fact, this is really all that we ask of government: protection of life and property. This amount of government makes us freer, more mobile citizens, doesn't it? Carry this whole thought a little bit further, and you arrive at the same conclusion that the Greeks did, even in the time before Christ. The Greeks said, without law, there can be no freedom. That seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? Without law, there can be no freedom? Well, what they meant was this, that if every one of us had to stand at our own front door with a shotgun or a baseball bat or something to protect our own life, our own property, and that of our family, then we would be restricted in our movement. We wouldn't be able to go out to go to work. We wouldn't be able to go into the fields. And so because we have somebody else looking after this very important feature of society, then we are more free. Therefore, those who sincerely advocate anarchy are, in reality, defeating their whole purpose. This is a good place to emphasize what we believe to be the proper function of government, which is the protection of life and property. Government should therefore be essentially a negative thing, not a positive thing. Government should not do things for you as much as it should prevent you or others from doing things to someone else. The government that's positive and does things for you has to take first from somebody else in order to do something for you. And of course, if it can take some of what you have, it can take all of what you have. And so we say, therefore, that government should be essentially a negative thing. We also say that anarchy is foolishness as a form of government. But, and this is a very important but, anarchy is advocated by some people, not because they want no government, but because they don't like what they have. Anarchy can be important as a means of change. If an individual doesn't like the form of government under which he lives, he can advocate anarchy so that when he has no government, he can then insert what he really would like to have in its place. Have there ever been any anarchists in our country? Well, how about a man who says if you don't like a law, break it? Disservice to one law is disservice to all, and this is essentially anarchy. How about an individual who says that this body of law is for black men, not white men, or this body of law is for white men, not black men? This, again, is essentially anarchy. And of course, I speak about groups like the SDS and the KKK and others. I think you know what I mean. Has there ever been anarchy in the United States? Yes, there has. We go back to Watts in California in 1965, to Detroit and to Newark in 1967. And we begin to remember, yeah, there was quite a bit of anarchy in the United States. This was a situation where the government had broken down. There was no government, in fact. There was rioting, there was looting, there was chaos, killing, burning, and it was a horrible situation. Now let me ask you a simple question. What might have happened had the situation that prevailed in Detroit and Watts and Newark existed in 200 different cities in this country at the same time? What do you think would have happened? Well, let me suggest to you that good people, just like yourselves, would have gone to the person best able to put an end to the anarchy and begged him to restore order. Now, who's best able to put an end to the situation I've described? The simple answer is the man who started it. And you know, history has shown us time and time again that good people, such as yourselves, will, in time of terrible chaos, go to the criminal savages and the brutes who have brought on the problem and beg them to please take over. And they do. And then what kind of government do you think you get? You get oligarchy ruled by man, where man has unlimited power. Anarchy is a frightful thing. Americans have often wondered how Asian and South American governments can be toppled or greatly influenced because of student rioting or general strikes. I guess that the citizens in Detroit and Watts and Newark could probably answer that question for us today. If you find yourself, as they did, in a situation where you fear for your life, where you stand behind your own front door with a gun or a baseball bat to protect your family, where you can't go to work to earn a living, and where you can't even go to the corner store, either for fear of being shot or because looters have cleaned the place out, you obviously can't exist in a situation like that for very long. The chaos is overwhelming. And so you or a group will, after just a matter of a few days, go to the person best able to put an end to that anarchy and ask him to do something. Please, take over. And he will. The American people have already shown the effects of isolated anarchy in the cry for law and order. But isn't there 100% law and order in the Soviet Union? What they have is unlimited law and order, but there's no justice. And we don't want unlimited law and order in America. We want limited government with justice. And therefore, let's conclude that anarchy is not a stable form of government either. It can be used as a transition from what you have to what someone else wants. It's dangerous, and it needs to be understood. Well, this brings us to a discussion of republics and democracies. We're going to spend a little more time discussing these because we believe there's so much confusion on these two forms of government. Let's begin by stating that most of the people in the United States think that we're a democracy and that we've never been anything else but. And yet, if we pledge allegiance to the flag, we pledge allegiance to the republic for which it stands. Is there a difference between republic and democracy, or is the John Birch Society just playing with semantics, as some have accused? Or is our system a democratic republic, or a republican democracy? Well, let's begin our analysis of these two forms by checking the etymology of the words. We begin by looking at democracy. It comes from two Greek words, demos and kratian. Demos, people. Kratian, to rule. And it means the people to rule, and of course that has always meant that when more people want something than don't, it's majority rules, and so democracy has come to mean majority rule. Now I know that majority rule has a nice ring to it. It sounds fine. A lot of people nod their head when they hear majority rule. But let me suggest to you that majority rule usually leads to mob rule, which becomes anarchy, and anarchy is followed by tyranny. And so there's something about democracy that I think we ought to examine. Now I'm going to prevail upon your goodwill here for a few minutes and ask you if we can conduct our affairs for the next few minutes in a democratic way. Let's establish a democracy and see what happens. That means, of course, that majority rules. Now immediately there's a fellow here in the audience who throws up his hand and proposes that we shave the heads of all the women. What are we going to do? Well, we have to consider his proposal. What we do is we ask him to come up forward and speak in favor of his proposal, and then somebody else comes up here and speaks opposed to it. Well, he comes up, and he's a very clever and witty individual. He's spoken before a lot of groups. Very clever. And he begins right away to convince everybody that this would be a fun thing to do. And then we ask a woman to come up, and she speaks opposed to it, but she's never spoken before a group before. She stutters and she stammers and she doesn't really do a very good job. You know what these people really are demagogues. That's what that word means. It means the leaders of the people. Well, after we've listened to the demagogues, now we have to count the hands. And so we ask everybody who's in favor of shaving the heads of the women to please raise their hand. We count the votes. Everybody opposed, please raise your hand. We count those votes. And lo and behold, what we have just decided that we're going to shave the heads of the women. And remember, majority rules. So what do? We proceed to shave the heads of the women. Now I did this one night before a group, and I went right up to the front row, and I said to a lady sitting there right in front of me with a beautiful head of hair, I said, well, here I am. I'm ready to shave your head. Are you ready? You know what she did? She pulled off her wig and handed it to me. Now, if I did that to a particular person, a lady sitting right here in the front row, what is her reaction liable to be? She's probably going to say to me, "You can't shave my head. I've got my rights." And she'd be absolutely correct. She might even go so far as to say, "I've got my constitutional rights," and she'd be even more correct. And do you know what she's describing is not a democracy at all? What she's describing is a republic. What then is a republic? Republic comes from two Latin words this time. It comes from res, thing, publica, public. The public thing, the law. And a true republic is one that has a law that recognizes the rights of individuals, and therefore the limitation in the law is not upon individuals, but upon the government. Let's put this whole thing in perspective in another example. We'll discuss what is commonly known as a lynch mob. I think you all know what a lynch mob is. We'll talk about it first in a democracy and then in a republic. First of all, lynch mob in a democracy. Here we have 35 horseback riders chasing one lone gunman. They catch him. They have a vote. Does he or does he not swing on the end of a rope? Well, the votes are counted. It's 35-1. He loses. And so he swings on the end of the rope. Let's talk now about the same lynch mob in a republic. We have 35 horseback riders chasing that same lone gunman, and they catch him. They vote 35-1 to hang him, and all of a sudden the sheriff rides up. The sheriff said, "You can't hang him. He's got his right to a fair trial." And so they take him back downtown. They select a jury of his peers. They hear the evidence, they hear the defense, and then they decide whether or not he hangs. Does the jury even decide majority rule? No. It has to be unanimous, or he still doesn't swing on the end of that rope. Well, where would you rather live, in a republic or a democracy? It becomes pretty obvious, doesn't it? You want limitation put upon mobs and majorities and governments. And so therefore you want a republic. This is what it's all about. Democracy, on the other hand, has long been recognized by honest historians as an invitation to mobocracy and then to tyranny. And yet, as I stated previously, most of the people in our country think that we are a democracy and that we've never been anything else but a democracy. Democracy did exist in the Greek city-states in the time before Christ. A wise man named Solon had counseled against the unbridled majority rule. Solon's laws were in fact the basis for a real republic, but the Greeks were never able to implement these wise principles. They never set up the form of a republic. Democracy ran wild in Greece as successive tyrants swayed the mobs with clever oratory and collectivist promises. In 454 B.C., the Romans adopted the laws of Solon and greatly improved upon the republic that they already had. True to the nature of a real republic, the Roman law limited the government, not the people. They had a system of checks and balances. They had diffusion of powers. They had real protection for the people from the folly of majority rule. In other words, the Roman people were free, and Rome became a very nice place to live. When men are free, they work harder, and they produce more. They do so because they're able to keep the fruits of their labor. They can keep it, they can trade it, they can sell it, they can give it away, and they can pass it on to their descendants. You know, the wealth of a nation isn't money. Wealth is productivity. When more people produce more goods, the wealth of the nation goes up. There's more to go around, and the standard of living goes up, the personal income goes up. As a result, Rome became a very nice place to live. It wasn't too long, however, before the Romans forgot their own heritage. They forgot what freedom was. If you remember nothing else I say in this whole presentation, please remember this. The essence of freedom is the limitation of government. The Romans forgot it. They knew that they were well off, and they began to look to government to protect their wonderful status. They made a fundamental mistake. It doesn't take too long for ambitious politicians to recognize that some people are ready to trade freedom for security. Soon, the politicians in Rome were exceeding the specific powers they were given in the Constitution. They were increasing their own power as they introduced socialistic programs. They began to appeal to mobs, and in reality, they converted the Roman Republic into democracy. If you remember anything at all about Roman history, I'll bet you remember that there were mobs who roamed the streets, demanding more bread and more circuses. As freedom was traded for security and government began to provide it, fewer people were producers, and more people began to live on the dole. Many had been convinced that the government actually owed them their bread and their entertainment. When productivity declined, there was less to go around, and some people went hungry. And then the mobs took to the streets to shake their fist at the system. But they were wrong, weren't they? Their problem wasn't with the system, it was with the perversion of the system. What they really should have sought was a return to the real system, the Republic. In time, the Roman Republic ceased to be, and in time, freedom died with it. It wasn't too long until a period known as the Dark Ages was ushered in, where freedom was almost totally unheard of. Well, how about our own nation? When our founding fathers broke away, they had a clean slate to write on. They could have set up any kind of system they wanted. They wisely looked back over history, and they gave us a republic. In fact, Benjamin Franklin was met outside the Constitutional Convention by a woman who said, "Sir, what have you given us?" And he said, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." There's a great deal of wisdom in that statement. When our founding fathers wrote the Declaration of Independence, they were in fact an oligarchy. They could have done whatever they pleased. In fact, some people came to George Washington and asked him to be a king. But George Washington and others did something fairly unique in history. They divested themselves of the power that they had, and they recommended a republic, limitation of government. And that's what we have. During the Constitutional Convention, great care was taken to specifically limit government. These men knew their history. They knew that the essence of freedom is the limitation of government. And so that's what they gave us. They built into it diffusion of powers, checks and balances. They wisely made sure that no government bureau could become so large that it would become oppressive. Even though they'd done their work well, there were some people at the convention who were still not satisfied. George Mason of Virginia, for example, refused to sign it, and it was largely through his efforts that the Bill of Rights was added, and that's the first 10 amendments. The Bill of Rights is nothing more than further guarantee of the limitation of government. It says the government can't do this, the government can't do this, and this, and this, and this, and the 10th Amendment says, if we forgot anything, you can't do that either. That's right. The first 10 amendments say, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Congress can abridge freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and so on. All the way up to the 10th Amendment that says those powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states and to the people. That's pretty clear, isn't it? It amounted to freedom. Another important feature of the beginning of our republic was that it was not imposed upon us. After promulgating the Constitution, the federal government asked the states to ratify it. In order to explain the Constitution to the people of New York, Hamilton and Madison and Jay wrote letters to the editor of a paper in the New York State. The letters have been collected and are known as the Federalist Papers. Eventually, New York and all the other states ratified the Constitution, and our republic began. Did you know that you can't find the word democracy in the Declaration of Independence? You can't find that word in the Constitution, and you can't find that word in the constitutions of any of the 50 states of this federal union of states. It just isn't there. You will find the word in the Federalist Papers, and there you'll find that our founding fathers greatly feared democracy. In one of the essays that is the Federalist Papers, James Madison said this: "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths." And so, this is a republic, not a democracy. Let's keep it that way. That's a slogan of the John Birch Society. It's not just semantics. The concepts involved here were once very clearly understood by the people in this nation. They certainly are not today. In 1916, President Wilson sent us into war with the slogan, "To make the world safe for democracy." There were many Americans then who knew that we were a republic and who opposed this drive toward democracy. But unfortunately, there weren't enough. And ever so gradually, the understanding of these differences became further and further destroyed. as we begin to slide more and more to majority rule and the tyranny which follows. Let's now make another conclusion. It is that democracy itself is not a stable form of government, but only a transition from the limited rule of a republic to the unlimited rule of an oligarchy. You may for a time live in democracy, but not for long. Democracy must lead to mobocracy and thence to tyranny. It can't go any other way. This leaves us just two ultimate forms of government: a republic with a rule of law where the law essentially limits the government, or an oligarchy with a rule by man where man has unlimited power. We've all heard the phrase, a government of laws or a government of man. This is what we're talking about. How has it happened that these fundamental ideas have been lost by our people? There are those who would insist that the present confusion is the result of evolution or chance. My own assessment is that there's a coordinated program to blot out the differences between republics and democracies in order to destroy the limitations built up into a republic. In other words, some people in influential positions want to make us a democracy which will lead to unlimited rule by them. As evidence of my belief that the whole drive is deliberate, let me share with you the definition of democracy given in the official U.S. Army training manual in 1928. This was a book used to train the troops in peacetime. It gave definitions of the various governmental systems, and it did a good job. What it said about democracy was absolutely correct. And so let me read this to you. Let me show you what our own government said about democracy in 1928. Democracy, a government of the masses, authority derived through mass meeting or any form of direct expression, results in mobocracy. Attitude toward property is communistic, negating property rights. Attitude towards the law is that the will of the majority shall regulate, whether it be based on deliberation or governed by passion, prejudice, and impulse, without restraint or regard to consequences. Results in demagogism, license, agitation, discontent, and anarchy. This is right on target. This is what our government said in 1928. Could you believe that an official government publication of the United States would say that the attitude of democracy toward property is communistic? Obviously, this very sound definition had to go, and it did. By 1952, the Army was using the Soldier's Guide, a Department of the Army field manual. And they had a new definition of democracy. It's just about as fundamental a change in the idea as you could possibly find. In 1952, here's what the Soldier's Guide had to say about democracy. Meaning of democracy. Because the United States is a democracy, the majority of our people decide how our government will be organized and run. This is exactly opposite to the thoughts expressed previously. It is, however, the prevailing opinion in this country, and it's leading us into tyranny. How easy it is to get the American people to go along with some proposal if they can be convinced that the majority wants it. And how willingly do we accept the decisions of the Supreme Court as the law of the land, whether they're unanimous or even 5-4 decisions. A Supreme Court decision isn't supposed to be the law of the land. It's the law of the case. The Constitution says that laws are to be made by Congress, and that's the legislative branch of government. The Supreme Court deserves a great deal of the blame for converting our republic into an unbridled mobocratic democracy. Those justices have taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And what they have done instead is that they have circumvented and abrogated and overruled and ignored the Constitution for years. Since 1954, the Supreme Court has destroyed the balance of power between the states and the federal government. It has destroyed all of our laws protecting us against internal subversion. It has made practically impossible the job of law enforcement agencies who are supposed to protect us from criminals. In many ways, the men who sit on the Supreme Court violate their oath of office, and they are one of the chief instruments in converting our free republic into a mobocratic democracy. The inevitable result is tyranny, ruled by man. I believe that this whole discussion is high school level material. It could be and it should be understood at that level, but it certainly isn't. In many of the schools I've visited, they teach a course called Problems of Democracy, and they ignore the biggest problem of all, that it leads to tyranny. You know, an interesting sidelight to this subject is to note how the enemies of Robert Welch have made him seem like a reckless fanatic. because the American people generally do believe that we are a democracy, if you can quote somebody as saying something bad about democracy, you can make him look very bad indeed. Robert Welch has said that democracy is a fraud. But he also said that we are a republic, and he went on to explain the difference between a republic and a democracy. But our enemies have only chosen one half of that statement, and they've made Robert Welch seem to be a reckless fanatic to many people. We have two illustrations of this right here. One of them appeared in 1961 in Look magazine. And we have another one right here in 1970. And of course, there are many, many illustrations of this same point all along. Did Robert Welch really say that democracy is a fraud? Of course he did. But he explained that we are a republic in a long and valuable speech. To quote only half of what he said is to promote a half-truth, which is essentially a lie. The intention was to deceive people into believing that Robert Welch is trying to destroy the government of the United States. Just the opposite is true. One final word about republic. Is the People's Republic of Red China a real republic? No. No, not at all. There's no limitation, no checks and balances. If the law really rules, the law is anything that Mao says goes. It's unlimited power in the hands of a man. And the same can be said of the Democratic Republic of East Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They aren't republics at all. Their name is simply more communist deceit. Let's move on to some economic considerations now. Most people believe that there's a great struggle going on in the world between communism and capitalism. Well, I certainly agree that there's a great struggle going on in the world, but I no longer believe that the adversaries are communists and capitalists. Let me begin to explain what I'm driving at here by another definition. My definition of capital. And my definition of capital is simply the means of production. It can be expanded to include that which enables you to acquire the means of production. But basically, capital is the means of production. To give a better idea of what this entails, let's consider a primitive economic being. A shipwrecked sailor just washed up on the shore of a small island. He has no food, no clothing. He's in trouble. He searches the island and he finds no food, no berries, no coconuts. He's in deep trouble. So he goes back into the water and he tries to catch fish with his bare hands. He's not able to do it. You and I both know that that's not easy to do. And so then he goes back up on shore. He finds himself a bush. He gnaws off a piece of the bush with his teeth. He makes himself a little spear. Now he goes back into the water, and now he's able to catch fish with his spear. What is his spear? His spear is capital. It's the means of production of fish for him. He gave up some of his time and some of his very precious energy to produce something that he couldn't eat, but something that would help him to produce something that he could eat. Well, with this definition of capital, then, how about a hammer? Isn't that capital? Certainly. How about a machine? How about your automobile? If all of these things are capital, well, then how about the communists in Russia, in China, in Cuba, or anywhere? Don't they use tools, machinery? Don't they use capital? They certainly do. And therefore, aren't they capitalists? They certainly are. Well, then, what's the difference between what they are and what we're supposed to be? The difference is between two kinds of capitalism. And that difference is best expressed with the words monopolistic capitalism and competitive capitalism. And it's between these two types of capitalism that the war rages, as we shall see. The essential difference between a monopolistic and a competitive capitalistic system is where the ownership and the control of the capital really lies. You know, ownership has many more features than simply holding title. I like to tell people I own my own home, and I certainly don't, and probably many of you are in that same boat. When we use the word ownership, we usually mean what I would call simple ownership, holding title to something. But complete ownership includes not only holding title, but also control, use, and the ability to dispose of what you think you own. In fact, that final consideration, the ability to dispose of what you think you own, is the ultimate test of ownership. You should be able to keep it, to sell it, to trade it, to give it away, to do whatever you wanted with it as long as you don't infringe on the rights of others. If someone tells you that you can't sell your home to him and you must sell it to him at that price, then you really don't own it in the complete sense. If you're unable to give your own son as an inheritance the fruits of your labor, then your ownership of those fruits is certainly incomplete. Now, control and use are also essential ingredients of ownership. If you don't control the use of your property, then simply holding title to it can be a burden. In fact, control is more important and far more beneficial than simple ownership. Let me explain what I mean here by telling you about my younger brother. I was in the Marine Corps for many years. During one part of my time in service, they sent me overseas. Now, I had an automobile, and it was mine. I owned it outright this time, completely. For 6 months, I was to be overseas, so for 6 months, I let my brother have my automobile. I owned it. I'd paid for it. I'd bought the tires, and I'd even filled the tank of gas before I left. But for 6 months, he controlled its use. Who was better off? The man who owned it or the man who controlled it? Or how about the man who has a son in college? For 2 weeks at Christmas time, the boy comes home from school. And for 2 weeks, the family car is not even seen by its owner. Dad paid for it. Dad even worries about it. But for 2 weeks, the son, who hasn't put up a nickel, controls the car. Well, who's better off? Obviously, the man who controls. In fact, simple ownership can be a burden. Getting back now to the two types of capitalism, let's analyze them in light of a more complete understanding of the importance of control over capital. In the monopolistic system, the capital is owned, and by that I mean somebody holds title to it, either privately or by the state. But it is controlled by a select few who are either the state or who control the state. In the competitive system, the capital is both owned and controlled privately. In other words, there are thousands of businessmen, large and small, who own their own little businesses and who do what they want with their own capital. Their only restriction is that they are not permitted to violate the life or the property of others. In the competitive system, we recognize the inherent right to property. In fact, the competitive system is a direct result of the existence of private property. The monopolistic system is a denial of the right of individuals to hold private property. There's no more basic difference between the two systems than this. Why do you think, for instance, that the communists have as a very cardinal principle of their whole program the destruction and the abolition of private property? It's because they're interested in monopolism. What kind of prices will a monopolistic system offer? In the monopolistic system, you'll find the producer will give you a high price because he's got no competition. Your only choice is not to buy. Also, a monopolist won't work very hard to put good quality into the product, and so you'll end up with poor quality. This is precisely why communist goods are so shoddy. With no competition, why should they produce other than junk? In the competitive system, the price will be the lowest possible because you've got 15 or 20 different producers vying for your business. And the quality will also be the best possible within the price range that you're willing to pay. And so, in a monopolistic system, you get a high price and poor quality. In a competitive system, you get high quality and a low price. Which do you choose? Well, if you're an honest, thrifty, hard-working producer, you certainly choose the competitive system. If you're part of the market, a consumer, you certainly choose the competitive system. But if you're lazy, stupid, or especially a criminal, you prefer the monopolistic system run by you. Isn't it a fact that criminals always seek to destroy their competition? Well, if a man starts a business and soon he finds himself with a competitor producing a similar product, he has a number of choices open to him if he wants to maintain a monopoly. How do you destroy competition? There are a number of ways of doing it. One way is to kill your competition. Another way is to hire a goon squad to go down there and bust up the competition's factory. Or because the government has given favorable legislation to labor unions and actually given them a monopoly over labor, you might be able to have the union call a strike over this man's labor force or his source of raw materials or his distribution system. You might be able to deny him the capability to produce in competition. There are other ways as well. We know that illegal and immoral pressure can be put on some individuals to force them to sell their own business. These methods of maintaining criminal monopoly can't be accomplished without the government being a party to it. If the proper function of government really is to protect life and property, then the goon squad and its originators should be apprehended and punished. If the government winks at all of this, looks the other way, monopoly is guaranteed. If the government sets up artificial controls in the hands of some corporations or some labor unions, then it is inviting monopoly at the expense of freedom. Generally speaking, monopoly can't exist without government being behind it. There are exceptions, very few in fact. A moral and legal monopoly would be one where an individual has produced a product that is so sophisticated and so wonderful that nobody else can figure out how to make it. Of course, that individual's monopoly will only exist for as long as it takes somebody else to figure out how to make his product. The point that I want to make and stress, however, is that government is behind monopolies. It has to be. Many people have asked me over the years why those who seemingly have benefited so greatly from the free enterprise system have no interest in fighting communism. They have no interest in protecting and preserving the competitive system. The people that I'm referring to, of course, are the giant corporation heads like Rockefeller in the oil and banking industry. It would certainly seem that these people have the most to lose if communism should become victorious. And yet, you never hear them opposing communism. Why? The reason why these people don't fight communism is that they are the same thing. They don't fight for a competitive free enterprise system because they are monopolists. And monopolists don't fight other monopolists. Monopolists fight the advocates of competitive free enterprise. They don't want competition. They want a drive for power and wealth, all at the expense of freedom. And this is precisely what the communists seek. We who still believe in the American dream are not capitalists as much as we are the advocates of competitive free enterprise. You know, we've allowed the term capitalist to be hung around our necks like a millstone. That term confuses the issue. It was probably meant to do so. You go onto a college campus today and you find a young fellow walking around that campus who claims to be patriotic. He still loves this country. Unfortunately, in many campuses, he'd be a rarity. But what happens to that young fellow? He'll be beset upon by the radicals. They'll grab him, they'll back him up against the wall, and they'll say, "Oh, you're a capitalist. Well, then go ahead. You defend the robber barons of the 1800s. You defend the child labor abuses and the giant conglomerates that are squeezing all the little people out of business. Go ahead. You're a capitalist." And what does that poor young student do? Well, actually, he's putty in their hands. He can't defend the obvious wrongs because they're indefensible. All he need do is to tell his adversaries that he's not a capitalist as much as he's an advocate of competitive free enterprise, an opponent of monopolies and the excesses that monopolies will bring. If he could only make that simple distinction, he'd be on the offense, and he'd probably gain an ally. Instead, because these simple concepts have been denied him, he retreats, he withdraws, probably he even joins the revolutionaries. There are 4 kinds of state monopolies. They are all alike in that the government controls the capital in every instance. What's different about them is how much of the capital is owned outright by the government. Now, before we analyze these different forms of state monopoly, which are fascism, Nazism, socialism, and communism, let's spend a moment and define the political spectrum. I've been a member of the John Birch Society for a good number of years and a member of the staff since 1966. Now, those of us who are members of the society can recall with me how often we've been referred to as fascists. How often we've been labeled extremists when asked to define what was meant by fascist or what this individual may mean by extremist. Our adversary is unable to give us an answer. But there really is a political spectrum, and all of these terms do have meaning. As far as I can determine, a good way to measure the political spectrum is to go from no government on the extreme right to total government on the extreme left. Now, total government includes any form of totalitarianism, and this would be fascism, Nazism, socialism, and communism. The total right would be anarchy, no government. We've already discussed the fact that the change from anarchy to total government is usually quite speedy. So what it boils down to is that either extreme is bad. If you arrive at a situation where no government prevails, you have a vacuum. Just as nature abhors a vacuum and something will rush in to fill it, when a governmental vacuum exists, something rushes in to fill that. History shows us that totalitarianism is the customary successor to anarchy. Well, what then is the moderate position? How about limited self-government, where the government is limited by constitutional law and the people are limited by freely accepted moral codes, such as the Ten Commandments? You're probably saying that this is precisely what you are for. Well, it's also precisely what the John Birch Society is for. And once again, it's a definition of Americanism. If you're in favor of the Constitution of the United States, you're a moderate, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. If someone insists on labeling you, make them define their terms. Ask them where they put themselves. Most honest political analysts portray the political spectrum as a bar graph from right to left. Because the jump from no government on the extreme right to total government on the extreme left is such an easy jump, I've begun to think that the political spectrum might be best portrayed as a horseshoe, so that the extremes are close together, and the system whose government is limited is furthest from both. But you know, the visual portrayal of this political spectrum isn't nearly as important as the understanding. You can choose your own pictorial representation as long as the definitions are maintained. The types of state monopoly are fascism, Nazism, socialism, and communism. In each, the capital is totally controlled by government. The only difference is how much of it is held in simple ownership. How much of it does the government hold title to? Italy had a fascist government under Mussolini. His whole point of view was to say, what's good for Italy is good for everybody. And so he said, I don't want to own your business. I just want to tell you what to produce and how much to produce and what prices to charge and who to hire and fire and where to buy your raw materials. But I don't want to own you, he said. Well, in effect, he owned everything because he controlled everything. And he was a totalitarian in every sense. Nazism stands for National Socialism. That's left wing, not right wing. In Germany, Hitler went one further step. He owned some of the businesses outright, such as the Volkswagen Corporation. He did not own the famous Krupp Iron Works, but he controlled Krupp in the same way that Mussolini controlled the Italian businesses. Hitler, too, was a totalitarian. The socialists don't arbitrarily own this business or that one. They simply own the major industries, such as communications and transportation and the utilities. Through their ownership and control of these vital segments of industry, they control everything else. And this is what exists in England. The socialists are in control no matter which party is in power, and their control is total. Finally, we come to communism, the granddaddy of all in the economic sense. I'm not talking about the communist conspiracy here, only communist economics. This system makes no pretenses anywhere. All the capital is owned outright and controlled outright by the state. No one but the state owns anything in any sense. It's interesting to note here that fascism is far more efficient than communism, and I'm certainly not advocating fascism. Please don't anybody get that idea. Under fascism, a good many people still think that they do own their business because they hold title to it. And as a result, they concern themselves with maintenance and upkeep on machinery, employee relations, and they even paint the building and cut the grass out in front of the place. In a communist system, there's no pretense about any of this. Hence, there's much less chance of anyone showing pride in his work or being deluded. Fascism is more efficient than communism. Have we ever had any fascism in the United States? I can remember back in 1962, an amazing thing happened. Mr. Roger Blau of United States Steel put on a pretty good show for us. I'll tell you why I think it was a good show later in the program here, but for now, let me simply state that I believe the whole business was a charade. What happened in 1962 was that President Kennedy issued guidelines for the steel industry. He said that if you wanted to raise your prices, you could only go this high, and you could not go beyond it. Roger Blau of U.S. Steel announced a price rise above what the guidelines had allowed. Well, the federal officials went after U.S. Steel, and within 24 hours, U.S. Steel brought their price back down. Mr. Blau capitulated very quickly. I was no business analyst then, and I'm still not one today, but I was amazed. How could a thing like that happen in a free enterprise system? Well, shortly after it did, I read an analysis of this whole business in a magazine article. The title of the article was "The Fascist New Frontier." Well, when I saw that title, I said to myself, that's rough stuff. But then I read the article. In it, the terms were defined, and I was forced to agree. It was government control without government outright ownership, and that's fascism. Early in 1970, John Kenneth Galbraith, famous economist, suggested in a speech that wage and price controls were absolutely necessary as a cure for inflation. Inflation is bad, I agree, but the wage and price controls only compound the problem. Without getting too deeply into the subject, inflation is a situation where money is losing value. Dollars won't buy today what they would previously. This condition is especially damaging to older people who live on fixed incomes. But inflation is caused by profligate spending of government. It's also caused by removing the backing from currency. And the way to cure inflation is to get the government to spend within its means and to put some real gold and real silver back behind the currency. Well, the socialists and the monopolists, who are really the cause of inflation due to their damaging policies, now propose as a cure for inflation an increase in power for themselves. This is treating the symptom and not the disease. It's in fact worsening the problem, and I'm sure that they realize it. It's like treating a cold by inducing pneumonia. Shortly after Galbraith told us how necessary wage and price controls are, Mr. Arthur Burns, the head of the Federal Reserve, said the same thing. And then other people began to jump on that bandwagon, some congressmen and then some senators. In the summer of 1970, Congress passed legislation authorizing the president to institute wage and price controls at his discretion. And President Nixon said he didn't want that kind of power as he signed the bill. Wage and price controls would amount to a giant step toward tyranny. We don't have to find ourselves with these controls around our necks, but it's going to take a great deal more awakening of our fellow citizens in order to keep it from happening. Winding up this discussion of economics, let's simply state that everyone who owns property is a capitalist. From the Aborigine with his blowgun, to the American businessman, to the slave master in Moscow. The difference in economic systems, when freedom is the consideration, is who owns the capital. Is it a monopoly system or a free enterprise system? And the important distinction to keep in mind is whether or not individuals can own, control, use, and dispose of property. Freedom and private property go hand in hand and always have. I'd like to again insist that what we've covered in this discussion is high school level or even junior high school level material. It could be and should be understood by young people. Now, it's very basic, I realize that. And there are some areas of economics that would certainly complicate what we've discussed here. But these very basic truths aren't being taught, and it certainly isn't understood by most of the people in our country. Let's now combine the economic and the political systems. Can there be such a thing as a monopolistic republic? No, not really. That makes about as much sense as dry water. A competitive free enterprise system run by an oligarchy is also hard to believe. If it has ever existed, it hasn't for very long. It might well have existed under a benevolent dictator or a kindly king. But a benevolent dictator or a kindly king can be replaced by someone who's not too benevolent or not too kindly. And also we have the problem that power corrupts, and the power possessed by an oligarchy such as a king or a dictator, will unfortunately lead to monopoly. The most probable combination of the political and economic systems is to have a monopolistic oligarchy or competitive free enterprise republic. As far as I'm concerned, you will live in one or the other. You may for a time live in transition, but these are the stable systems. As to which you choose, I really don't have much doubt. Unless, as was discussed previously, you're a criminal. If you're the ordinary, hard-working, God-fearing type who wants to be left alone, then you want the free enterprise republic. But in order to have it, you're going to have to realize that you've got to work for it. And you've got to get busy now. Freedom isn't free. The confusion and the deception of the American people on these fundamental concepts is not accidental. As we pointed out before, there's evidence to show that the distinction between republics and democracies has been deliberately blurred. The same can be said of the distinction between competitive free enterprise and monopolism. Those who are anxious to destroy our free republic and rule us in a monopolistic oligarchy have been working to achieve it for generations. They've deceived, they've distorted, and they've duped millions of people in their drive for power. Working stealthily from behind scenes, they've reached a position now where success for them is in sight. Well, what I've just described to you is a conspiracy. A conspiracy is a plot to accomplish an evil purpose. I have no doubt that there are individuals who are working together to seize total power. That it is an evil thing is equally certain. I contend it would be evil to destroy freedom. In the second part of this film, we'll discuss the conspiracy. We took all of this time in order to provide you with definitions and to lay a base of understanding. Now we'll discuss names and organizations and methods of operation of this conspiracy. We'll also present the plans and the programs that can defeat it. Recall, if you will, with me, the title of this presentation, An Overview of Our World. The overview is an understanding of the conspiracy. Once an individual accepts this basic premise, the many confusing events of the day fall right into place. If you can begin to see what we mean by this conspiracy, then we certainly hope that you'll stay to view the remainder of the film. At this point in the program, I usually discuss some of the literature that we have available. Many people have come to me and asked me if there are specific pieces of literature that they could read to get a better understanding of the things that we've talked about. And there are. One of the best things that I think anyone can read on these subjects is a short book called The Law, written by a man named Bastiat, who was in fact a Frenchman who lived about 140 years ago. He wrote this book in the 1840s in France. In fact, he was facing the same problems in France that we find ourselves combating today. And his little book of about 65 pages is the best definition of the proper role of government that I think can be found anywhere. It's written in easy-to-read style, could be and should be understood by high school students today. And so we recommend The Law very, very highly. Now, another book that we recommend very highly is the Blue Book of the John Birch Society. When the John Birch Society was founded in 1958, it was founded at a two-day meeting. Robert Welch spoke to an assembly of 11 men for 2 full days. The transcript of what he said then is now the Blue Book of the John Birch Society. And the Blue Book is simply an analysis of the problems and then a possible solution. Along the way, the author gave his own thoughts in the area of political science and economics, and he gave a very valuable explanation of many important things. The Blue Book contains a course in political science that is far greater than you'll receive if you go to college today in many cases. And so we recommend the Blue Book of the John Birch Society not only because it has so many of these basic truths that we've talked about, but also because it's a concrete plan to follow to overturn a great conspiracy. Now, another book that we recommend is The Politician by Robert Welch. This is probably the most controversial book of the 20th century, if not the whole world. It's the biography of Dwight David Eisenhower. We're aware that many people are very upset about the fact of this book, but most of the people who are upset about it have never read it. If you're like me, you'll read The Politician and you'll get so angry that you'll probably fling the book against the wall. And then you'll go and pick it up again and read some more. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the facts in the book have never been disproven. Only the possible conclusions of the author have been called into question. In fact, the history contained in this book is so important that we say you can't really understand what has happened in this world for the last 30 years without reading The Politician. And so we urge that you do. And keep in mind the author's closing, where he says that if this history is disturbing to both the reader and myself, don't blame him who wrote it, blame him who made it. The final book that I wanted to recommend is called Quest of a Hemisphere. It's a history book. It's written for high school and junior high school students. It has been recently published by Western Islands, which is an affiliate of the John Birch Society. It's what we think is the finest history book published in this country in the 20th century. In fact, anybody who reads that book will learn something good about this country that he never knew before, with very few exceptions, I'm sure. The Quest of a Hemisphere is readable history, and it's important history, because Americanism is such a different thing from any other government system that ever came before. And so if you have a young person in your family, or if you yourself would like to again appreciate the fact of Americanism, we recommend The Quest of a Hemisphere by Donzella Cross Boyle.